This morning, we are going to continue our consideration of headship and submission because, frankly, I haven't offended enough people yet. So we have to keep going. We're going to look at Ephesians 5 this morning. I joke about that. I don't set out to offend people, obviously, but the reality is that these passages do challenge sort of our postmodern sensibilities, and they say things that for some people sort of get our hackles up, as it were. And as a case in point, Ephesians 5:22 says, "Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their as to whether or not headship and submission are part of the message." And so what we have to do, rather than trying to write Paul out of the Bible, is try to understand these terms and come to our own terms with them. And last week, we focused on headship, and the thing that I suggested to you then is that headship assumes sacrificial responsibility. So that rather than looking at headship through this really prodigal lens that says headship is about domination and control, headship assumes a certain kind of burden. And that burden is in the mutual interest of the head and the body. And so the assumption of that burden is supported by the body. And of course, the ultimate example of that is Jesus Christ. All right, so Jesus assumes the burden of our sin, makes himself a sacrifice on our behalf, and when we submit ourselves to Christ, we become part of his body. And so this is how this particular section of Scripture opens up in Ephesians 5:1 and 2. It says, "Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." So there's a couple of things I really need you guys to understand. First off, the prevailing context of Paul's advice is the call to the church to live in submission to the headship of Jesus Christ. That's the context of the whole passage. And so Paul is going to talk through the opening parts of that passage. Really, at the end of the previous chapter is part of that conversation as well. But he's going to talk through this passage about the importance of things like our personal purity, our healthy use of language, our character, our vigilance against evil forces, our wisdom, our faithfulness, and ultimately it's really all about the oneness of the body in pursuing the head, which is Jesus Christ. And even as he gets into these more specific instructions about household, about husbands and wives, he makes it very clear that he's speaking about this as a metaphor for the relationship between Christ and the church. He calls it a profound mystery. And so really what we end up with is this idea that submission is one of the most important kingdom virtues for everybody. In verse 15 and 16, he says, "Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil." And the opportunity that we're making the most of here takes the form of submission to Christ. Now, last week, we sort of ended with this statement that the objective of sacrificial responsibility, the objective of the head is to make room for kingdom things. And in submitting to the headship of Jesus Christ, we're actually joining Christ in his kingdom work of making room. So we become room makers ourselves. And so what I want to say this week is that the objective of both headship and submission is to make room for an abundant kingdom life. This is what it's all about. Now, we're discussing relationships of oneness here. Paul's talking about the church, and he talks about marriage in relationship to the way that the church is going to function. This all functions because of our shared objective. And our shared objective specifically is the kingdom of Christ. If our shared objective is the kingdom of Christ, then it displaces selfish ambition in all of us. And this is one of the reasons that we really struggle to comprehend these concepts when they come up in Scripture, because we kind of don't have anything that we don't look at through the lens of our selfish ambition. We kind of assume that everything is going to function that way. But the real work of headship is to make room for the kingdom. And the work of submission, the work of the body, is to support the work of making room for the kingdom. That's core to it all. So kids, one of the things that means is that whether you're leading or following, you can be a blessing. And in your lifetime, you will be called upon to do both. There's times that you will be called upon to step up as a leader. There's times that you will be called upon to follow someone else's lead. In both, you can be a blessing. Which means, of course, that you could also not be a blessing. In both of these things, we can choose to be self-centered and self-serving. But in both of these things, we can serve a higher purpose. And maybe even especially as followers, we have an opportunity to serve a higher purpose, because let's be honest, we will be called to submission in life much more than we'll be called to headship. Headship is sort of the rare exception. Most of what we do is about submission. In fact, the most important, most powerful thing that we can do in our faith walk is be submitted to Christ. That's where everything begins. Ephesians 5:21 then, Paul says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now, this is the verse that comes right before this passage about husbands and wives. And so a lot of people look at this as an introduction to that passage, submit to each other, husbands and wives. And I think that's probably legitimate. It's also a capstone to everything that Paul has been talking about in terms of being submitted to Christ as the church and living as people who are submitted to Christ. There's a couple of things I want to point out about this. Submission in the kingdom is kind of the go-to virtue. And that's why Jesus says, in order to be disciples, very first step is deny yourself. Get you out of the way, and then maybe we'll be able to do something. But here's something we need to understand from Ephesians 5:21. This submission is, by its nature, dynamic and elective. When we choose to submit ourselves to Christ and to kingdom things, that is a powerful, consequential choice. It causes a lot of important things to happen. It makes us a part of the greater mission of Christ. But also, it's a choice. Submission is always a choice. Christ doesn't say, you have to follow me. Christ invites us to follow him. And so when we're talking about submission, the worldly idea of submission is really twisted in this regard, in that we think it's something that we could force on another person. We could put them into subjection, and that's what submission is. That's not what submission is. Submission is a choice that we make. Christ asks us to submit ourselves to his will and to his kingdom. He doesn't force that upon us. In fact, that's an important aspect of gospel theology. It is a choice. It is an act of love and trust. And it's why I have made this argument with you that the authority that we're talking about, the authority of the head, is not the kind of authority that the world thinks about. It's not about control and domination, because as soon as submission is forced, it's no longer submission. The real power of submission is, in fact, that we choose it. As Christ chose to submit himself to the Father, and we choose to submit ourselves to Christ, that's where the power comes from. still raises this question: how then do we go about submitting to one another? What does that look like? I have been lately watching old Looney Tunes from the 50s and 60s. Because let's face it, there's nothing on TV, right? So these are cartoons that I grew up with, and so I'm getting a kick out of sort of going through them and remembering them and sort of watching the history of it and how all the characters developed. But you remember in Looney Tunes, those of you who share this predilection with me, the two gophers, Mac and Tosh. Mac and Tosh are these two overly polite British gophers, right? And Mac and Tosh, one of the funny things about them in the cartoons is that they have a struggle getting anything done because they're so overly polite. And so Mac will say, "After you," and Tosh will say, "Oh, no. After you, of course. Indubitably." A lot of that sort of thing. This is this is the picture that I get when we talk about being in submission to submit to one another out of reverence. How does that work? We're all so busy trying to submit to one another that nobody ever takes the lead. I think maybe a more realistic appraisal of what Paul is asking us to do looks like this. Whenever anyone assumes sacrificial responsibility for expanding the kingdom, submission is the appropriate response. In other words, when other people place the kingdom before themselves, we treat that sacrifice, we treat that spirit within them with our honor and support. It doesn't really matter who they are. Now, that doesn't mean that people have our submission to do whatever they want to do, because that's where sort of selfish ambition comes into play. Headship doesn't serve selfish ambition, it serves kingdom. So I'm talking specifically about when people are living sacrificially for the kingdom, we honor that. When we apply this to husbands and wives, there is this sense of mutual submission, and that's probably why verse 21 leads off the passage the way that it does. But it's also clear from Paul's message that that submission is uniquely expressed. It's different for husbands and wives. It is compatible. They are working together, but it is different. That's important. It's an important thing for us to acknowledge because the appointed work of men and women is often indistinguishable. So if you think about creating space like raising a great tent, and the tent represents how we sort of hold back the world. And we create inside this kingdom space in the midst of the world. This kingdom space in which kingdom things can happen, in which our members can thrive. If men and women are the tent poles of that tent, if they're holding back the world, if they're creating that space, when we look at that from the outside, it's not clear who was the first pole. It's not clear who's the head and who's in submission because kingdom work is cooperative and interdependent. The differences between us are very subtle and sometimes indistinguishable. And that's why I'm uncomfortable when our discussions about the work of men and women degenerate into our cultural assumptions about what our roles should be. Now, obviously, there are some clear roles, some clear role differences between men and women. Women are the only ones who are designed by God to recreate life and then nurture that life. So we talked about that when we talked about motherhood. What this sometimes leads to is our assumption that women are the nurturers of the two genders. And I think that's dangerous. I think it's dangerous for us to sort of make these overly broad statements about what our roles are, because then the implication is that men are not involved in the nurturing of their children. And that's devastating. That's a devastating assumption. So, headship and submission is not really about hierarchy. It's not about overly rigid roles. It's really about how we share our kingdom-driven purpose. Incidentally, kids, even children are part of the work of household. Sometimes you like to not think so, but we're all part of the work of household. Large part of parenting is helping children understand that what they do, the choices that they make, are either supporting or undermining kingdom in our household. And we need to hold our kids accountable to that. In other words, we're kind of all in this together. And that's where this whole conversation has to begin. No matter what Paul says about the differences between us, the conversation has to begin with the understanding that we're all in this together. And thus, Paul can say, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. But then he very specifically goes on to describe different kinds of submission. We read the passage about wives. Let's read the passage about husbands from verse 25 and following. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. And this is what makes Paul rather controversial. It's what makes the Bible rather controversial in the culture. Scripture tends to impose an onus of spiritual responsibility on men. So if we go back to Genesis, it is the man who has the responsibility for initiating a new household. If we read Paul in Romans, it will be the sin of Adam that is responsible for the fall of humanity, not the sin of Eve, even though presumably sure her sin was first. If we read Peter, Peter says, treat your wife, husbands, as the weaker vessel, treat her well, or your prayers will be hindered. There is no corresponding warning like that for women. And Paul here says, wives, submit to your husbands in all things, but husbands, love and serve your wife sacrificially as Christ does with the church. I hope you can see where I'm pulling this idea of sacrificial spiritual responsibility from. It's not just something I've conjured in my imagination. It's there on the page. Now, I understand that culturally right now, a lot of women are going to say, even in marriage, I don't want, need, or expect any man to assume that kind of sacrificial responsibility for me. And scripturally, it doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't seem to matter because the husband will still be accountable for this. Paul never tells husbands to become the head or to act like the head or to assume that authority. He simply tells them they are. And they better step up to the responsibility of it. And we're not comfortable with that culturally. And we're not comfortable with it for a handful of reasons, but let me address a couple of them. First of all, the prodigal threat is that headship will be abusive. Because we regard headship as power rather than responsibility, we assume that it will naturally lend itself to abusiveness. And here's what's fascinating. We've actually researched this. There's research around this topic, which I think is kind of amazing. So they researched a bunch of men who aligned themselves with this headship doctrine. And here's what they found. I think this is fascinating. The assumption was that in these households, there would be more control and abuse. And here's what they found. Men who knew of the doctrine of headship, but who were not an active part of church fellowship, their wives reported them to be more controlling and abusive. Men who knew of the doctrine of headship, but who were active in church, their wives actually reported that they were extremely well treated and respected. Now, there's a number of ways to interpret those results. This is how I interpret it. It's only in a cursory, worldly understanding of headship that we get abuse. Because when we go deeper, when we have a biblical understanding of what exactly we are calling men to do, it imposes on them such a high standard of love and service that it prohibits anything abusive. The prodigal error is that headship will be abandoned. And headship is largely abandoned in our culture in a couple of different ways. First of all, women and wives perceive this headship idea as an unfair distinction. They think that it imposes control and hierarchy and patriarchy, and so they simply reject headship as a notion, refuse to acknowledge that it exists. Or men and husbands, sort of somewhat answering to the culture, but also, in all honesty, answering to their own selfish nature, will simply never step up to the standard of headship. And my overall point here is that headship imposes on men a subtle but primary spiritual responsibility for their households. I say it's subtle because it definitely does not take the form of authority that the world imagines. It's subtle because husbands and wives serve together, often interchangeably in the work of forming household as a kingdom space. And yet there remains this expectation that a man will put his wife and children ahead of himself. It's kind of like the old maritime doctrine of women and children first. Headship calls men specifically to form household and to lead that household towards kingdom such that a wife and children can be submitted to that headship without any fear. Now, the prodigal tendency of men is to seek control in their relationships and to resign their responsibility. So despite the fact that we have this kind of calling, we tend to seek our own way and our own will and steadfastly avoid any kind of personal spiritual responsibility for others. And there's a cultural emphasis right now on sameness. And in the name of fairness and equality, we've effectively encouraged men not to assume headship in any form. Well, let's just think for a second about the impact of that. Right now in America, we lead the world in absentee fathers. The world. That's our record. And women far outnumber men in every major denomination of the church. Why? Largely because men sidestep the responsibility for the spiritual formation of their families. Now, the prodigal tendency of women is to seek control in order to impose responsibility. See, we are the same in a lot of ways, certainly in terms of selfish ambition. A woman will also seek her own will and her own way. But women also want men to exercise the practice of headship, if not headship itself. Modern feminism is really premised on the assumption of male deference. In other words, since most of us can acknowledge that men in general are bigger, stronger, and faster than women in general, since men have the physical capacity to dominate women, we expect them to exercise restraint. We have that standard. We expect them to be gentlemen. We expect them to treat women with deference. All of our notions of equality are essentially hinging upon men demonstrating that deference. And so we expect men to be different, and most women want men to be different. I think women who understand Paul's words want their husbands to be Christ-like in their relationships. But if he's not, a woman may exercise a kind of emotional control of her husband in an attempt to compel him to exhibit the characteristics of headship. And there's an irony in this, because if she's pushing him to act like the head, she's being the head, pushing him to act like the head. Proverbs 25:24, maybe this is what Proverbs meant. Better to live on the corner of the roof than share a house with a quarrelsome wife. Honestly, I just threw that one in to raise the offensiveness quotient of the whole message. If I hadn't gotten you yet, surely I've got you now. Now, Ephesians 5:32 and 33, Paul wraps it up this way. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and his wife must respect her husband. I mean, really the point is, husbands and wives get this wrong all the time. We get it wrong. That doesn't mean that the principle is wrong. Part of us, especially the part that is informed primarily by the culture, is tempted to reject all of this outright. And it's kind of like this with all kingdom things. As we go through this series, maybe you pick up on that running theme. Our resistance to the way of Jesus is really rooted in this mythology that the way that we're doing it now is somehow better than the way that God had planned. And we've got to ask ourselves, honestly, is that the case? When I answer to my will about these things, is it creating oneness in my marriage? Is it resulting in the spiritual formation of my children? Is it making our household an outpost of kingdom? See, the kingdom of Jesus is here. It's already present in many ways. We bring our imperfection to it, regardless of what role we're asked to play. When we're asked to play the role of the head, when we're asked to play the role of submission, we bring our sin, our imperfection, and our flaws to all of that, and so we do it in a kind of a broken way. But it's because of our head, Jesus Christ, because of his sacrifice and because of his perfection, there is this possibility of kingdom in everything. And the mystery that Paul talks about, this mystery of how our relationships are supposed to work and how these dynamics are supposed to play out, they're all revealed in the person of Jesus Christ. And the role of Christ is to create kingdom space in which the church can thrive. That's what Christ does for us. He raises the roof. He holds back the world. He creates this outpost of kingdom in which we, in spite of all of our imperfection, can pursue these kingdom ideals with each other. We could not do this without him. But the interesting thing is, he also makes himself dependent upon us to follow through with this kingdom idea. And so the role of the church is to thrive within and grow the space that Christ has created. So ultimately, submission is not about subjecting ourselves to the selfish will of others. It is about honoring a greater kingdom purpose in our lives, in our homes, in our churches, and in the world. But submission does call us, all of us, men and women both, to set our selfish nature aside and actively become seekers and followers of Christ's kingdom will.